he thinks this is just a political hit job by his political opponents, and as he calls it, the left-wing media, which I'm sure public media is wrapped in that.
Hi, I'm Scott Leadingham. Thanks for joining us here in the unique Northwest. There is news out there beyond coronavirus, beyond protests for racial justice, and we're going to get into some of it today. And joining us to talk about it is Nick Deshay. Thanks for joining us today, Nick.
Nice to be here. Good to see you, Scott.
Good to be seen. Nick, you are out there covering the inland Northwest from your perch in Spokane and areas beyond. And one of the things, of course, that might be easy to forget if it weren't for so many yard signs reminding us is that this is an election year. And of course, one of the big races on the ballot in November will be for the governor of Washington State. Governor Jay Inslee, of course, running for a rare third term, and it's a rather crowded field for the upcoming August primary. More than 30 people on the ballot running for the top two spots that will be on the ballot in November. The top Republican, or one of the top Republican contenders at the moment, is Loren Culp, the police chief for the Ferry County town of Republic. And Nick, some interesting reporting of late about Mr. Culp. What is he in the news for?
Well, he's in the news here in 2020 for a lawsuit filed in 2017 when he was a narcotics detective in Republic back in 2013, 2014. 17-year-old girl went to the police and said that she had been molested since the age of 5. The investigation kind of carried on through the sheriff's department up there in Ferry County. They enrolled Mr. Culp in the investigation for one interview, he says. They ended up passing on the investigation. Mr. Culp in his report said he didn't find the girl to be credible, didn't think she was telling the truth. That would have been the end of it, except for the girl's grandparents, who live down in the Tri-Cities area, kind of brought the issue to the Benton County Sheriff's Office. They did their own investigation, and it led to this man, Roy Moore Jr. is his name, being sentenced to 67 months in prisons for child rape, child incest, and related charges. So what happened a few years later is the girl sued because she thought it was a botched investigation. She sued 3 years ago, and the Seattle Times reported on it, and so it kind of became news because he's a gubernatorial candidate.
And you talked to Loren Culp recently about this, of course, as it was in the news again. And what did he say in his defense and about why the lawsuit is sort of popping up again in the news at this time?
Well, he denies any wrongdoing. He pointed out he was just asked to help out on one interview by a friend or a colleague of his at the sheriff's office. So he just vehemently denies any allegations. Of course, he thinks this is just a political hit job by his political opponents, and as he calls it, the left-wing media, which I'm sure public media is wrapped in that.
Although remind us, though, Loren Culp was not a new name to pop up on even the national radar in the last few years since he declared his run for governor. And he's the police chief now of a pretty small town in northeastern Washington, but he'd actually made big national headlines before that. And he'd been in the news on Fox News nationally. In fact, yeah. What was that about?
2018, if you recall, the voters of Washington passed a gun control measure saying we wanted stricter gun control. He was one of the sheriffs, if not the first sheriff, to say he would not enforce the law because he thought it was illegal and unconstitutional. Of course, this made the news, got a lot of people interested in him, and that's when he decided to run for governor. He's not a big fan of Governor Inslee. He thinks he's more akin to a dictator than a duly elected Democratic governor, small d Democratic governor. So that's when he first made the news, and he's a pretty green politician in that sense.
The comments toward Governor Inslee and the response to the coronavirus measures. You talked to Loren Culp and other candidates for governor earlier this year, before there was so many, frankly, who had declared. And what were they saying about the response at that time? I think this was, in April or so, about Governor Inslee's response to the coronavirus pandemic at that time.
Well, the few I talked to all had very similar things to say, except for Phil Fortunato, who's a legislator. He was a little more tempered in his views, but the others, like Mr. Culp and Tim Eyman, in no uncertain terms, was very negative on Inslee. I think he called him a little North Korean dictator. He used the word dictator a lot. I asked him, I said, well, what would you do differently if you were in the same position as Governor Inslee dealing with this pandemic and how to, make decisions when it comes to public health? And he said, well, I wouldn't be a dictator. So this is kind of the theme. He thinks liberal people, or liberals as he calls them, the left-wing media, is kind of out to get people like him. And he's pushing back pretty hard.
Well, it's all good information. We thank you for sharing it with us, Nick. But we're not going to let you get away without saying a little bit of a goodbye and a thank you for your time in the Inland Northwest correspondent position. This will be, I guess, your last official week, but we hope to maybe have you again down the road in the future. It's been great having you on board, Nick.
Thanks, Scott. I appreciate it. Same to you.
And we now turn to Courtney Flatt in the Tri-Cities. Thanks for joining us today, Courtney.
Thanks for having me, Scott.
It is summer, of course, and many people might be itching to get out and explore, even during the pandemic, in a safe, social distance manner. And one of the places they might want to go is the North Cascades of Washington, a beautiful mountainous region. But when they get there, they might not see so many grizzly bears because, quite frankly, there aren't many. And there probably aren't going to be many in the future because of a recent federal decision. And Courtney Flatt joins to talk a little bit about that. What's up with that, Courtney?
Yeah, so back in 2015, the federal government began working on options to potentially bring grizzly bears into the North Cascades. They eventually developed 4 alternatives for the bears. Now, Interior Secretary David Bernhardt has scrapped those plans. The reason biologists and conservationists say they need to bring grizzlies into the rugged areas of the North Cascades is that they estimate there are fewer than 10 grizzlies left. Biologists say grizzlies in Washington can't recover on their own. They need to bring in bears from Montana or British Columbia. Recently, ranchers have brought up concerns about having another large predator on the landscape, and they've often felt they haven't been listened to in recent discussions.
And this was sort of a course change, right, for the federal government, or particularly the Interior Secretary, to be against it or to make this decision, considering previous Interior Secretary, President Trump's first one, Ryan Zinke, was rather in favor of reintroduction. He's from Western Montana, kind of had said these things speaking in favor of grizzly bears. So what happened with the dynamics there?
When he was Interior Secretary, Ryan Zinke made a surprise visit to Washington, and this was after his department had paused the federal government's analysis of potential plans. But in that visit, he said he supported the great bear, and he wanted recovery efforts to be done slowly and correctly. But over the last couple of years, since Zinke is no longer in office, Dan Newhouse, who represents parts of the North Cascades Grizzly Recovery Zone, has pushed to stop any reintroduction efforts. Newhouse had the federal government reopen the comment period. He held another open house in Okanagan last year, and hundreds of people turned up who were opposed to bringing grizzlies into Washington, people who said they hadn't been given a chance to comment in the past. But as a part of the earlier planning process that I talked about, the federal government had already held meetings across the state. There were webinars, there were around 70 informal meetings across Washington. But now Newhouse and Interior Secretary Bernhardt recently held a small roundtable in OMAC, and they invited people who were concerned about grizzly plans. That's where they made this big announcement that grizzlies were okay elsewhere and didn't need to be recovered in Washington. But conservation groups say these 2 officials are only listening to some of their constituents, and they say they're weighing their options on what they can do next. That could include lawsuits.
All right, let's delve into a little bit on what both of those sides were saying, although there's probably more than just 2 sides to the issue. The conservation groups, though, generally, who were in favor, and the ranching interest, the landowner interest, and Congressman Newhouse on the other side, what were kind of some of their arguments for and against?
Yeah, so kind of a broad overview. The ranchers who have most recently spoken out have said they're concerned about bringing more predators onto the landscape. They're already dealing with wolves, and they've really felt like people who don't live near where the grizzlies could be relocated are driving decisions that could cause them big problems. And there's one conservation group I talked to in the Methow Valley, and they say a lot of people in the area support bringing grizzlies back. There have been studies that show grizzlies make ecosystems healthier, and introduction efforts would be slow and controlled. And without the help that these plans would have given them, they'll go extinct in the North Cascades.
I want to delve a little bit into Congressman Newhouse, because he seems pretty adept at wrangling some of these thorny, if you want to call them controversial issues that involve the federal government and maybe state government, and getting his constituents to be heard, or at least some portion of his constituents. In particular, we have this grizzly story, but in other cases, he's been very involved in the issue of Snake River dams and boosting of hydroelectric power in the region, particularly in the southeastern Washington region. And so I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit more about some of his background and how he's done in that area of getting maybe some of his constituents out for public meetings that often involve, some we might say, boisterous opinions being shared with federal officials.
Yes, Congressman Newhouse really likes to give people a chance to talk, I guess you would say. He had reopened these Grizzly meetings earlier when there were big discussions about what was going to happen to the Snake River dams. He held meetings in the Tri-Cities. Those meetings were often largely driven by interests who wanted to keep the dams in place. Most recently, he has worked on a bill with Representative Kathy McMorris Rogers that would classify hydropower as a renewable energy resource and would make licensing easier for small hydro projects that protect or enhance natural resources. But there have also been some conservation groups that have said hydropower does come with a lot of costs.
Indeed, as many decisions come with a lot of costs and consequences to consider, and we thank you for bringing all of these issues to us. Thanks for joining us today, Courtney.
Thanks for having me.
You can read more on these and other stories at our website, nwpb.org. Thank you for joining us here in the unique Northwest.